I want to talk for a few minutes about the text and canon of the Hebrew Bible. What is the Hebrew Bible? Well, the Hebrew Bible is the scripture of non-believing Jews. Christians, of course, call it the Old Testament, but for Jews it's not the Old Testament, it's just the Bible. Now, of course, the canon of the Old Testament, that is, the collection of authoritative books that Christians call the Old Testament, is slightly different depending on whether you're a Protestant or a Roman Catholic or a Greek Orthodox and so forth, or an Ethiopic Christian. The Roman Catholic Church has 7 additional books in its Old Testament, some of which weren't written in Hebrew. Some of the books in the Roman Catholic Old Testament were originally written in Greek. There are a few slightly different list of books if you're a Russian Orthodox or a Greek Orthodox, and I believe even a slightly different set of books if you're Ethiopic. Now, the vast majority of them are the same. Protestants pretty much have the same Old Testament as non-believing Jews call Scripture. Now, there are some Anglicans and Episcopals that use some of the same books that the Roman Catholics do, but most Protestants, the Old Testament for most Protestants is the same basic collection as the Jewish Bible for non-believing Jews. And again, the canon, a canon is a measuring rod. And when we talk about a scriptural canon, we're saying, what are the books? What is the collection of books that is authoritative? And it basically comes down to a canon list, a list of books. The Old Testament of most Protestants was originally written in Hebrew. As I said, the Roman Catholic Old Testament does have some books that were written originally in Greek. But the original language of the Old Testament, the Protestant Old Testament, of all the books, and of the Jewish Bible, those books were written in Hebrew. Now, there are some sections in Daniel and Ezra that were originally in Aramaic, which is a related language, but the overwhelming majority of the Protestant Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. I've explained the canon is the collection of authoritative books, which books go in. And when I say the text of the Hebrew Bible, I'm alluding to the fact that we don't have any of the original books of the Old Testament. We don't have the original Isaiah. We don't have the original Psalms. We don't have manuscripts actually that come anywhere close to the time that these books were written. Now, as I'll say at the end of this video, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s, it took us back almost 1,000 years earlier in terms of having copies and having manuscripts, handwritten copies of the Old Testament. Some scholars question whether it even makes sense to speak of an original text of a book like Isaiah, for example, because they think of Old Testament books as being a little bit more like rolling snowballs that were edited and so went through kind of various editions, a process that could have taken some time to get to what we now call the completed version. Again, that's a matter of some debate, but that gives you some sense of what's in this video. This video on the text, how did it read, and canon, what were the books of the Hebrew Bible, which is the Protestant Old Testament. If you had asked for the Bible at the time of Jesus, at the time of the New Testament, it would not have been arranged the way that your Old Testament is arranged if you buy a Protestant Bible off the shelf. If you take some Old Testament Bible courses at a Christian college today, you might have a course on the historical books that might be from Joshua to Esther. You might have a course on poetic books, that's Job through Song of Solomon. You might have a course in the major prophets, which is the longer prophetic books, or the minor prophets, which are the 12 short prophets at the end of the Old Testament. That's the way that Protestant Bibles, Old Testaments, are arranged today. That's not the way that Jews at the time of Jesus thought of how to arrange the books of the Old Testament. And of course, the book form was not used. You could not, at the time of Jesus, open a book that had the Old Testament. Rather, the Old Testament was a collection of scrolls. And so when we talk about the first part of the Old Testament, and whether you're a Jew or a Protestant or a Roman Catholic or an Orthodox, the first part is the same. The law, the first 5 books, the Hebrew word for law is Torah. Pentateuch is another name for it, means 5 scrolls. And so at the time of Jesus, you didn't have a book with Genesis, even a book with Genesis through Deuteronomy, in it. Rather, you had 5 scrolls that were thought of as the first part of the canon: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So there were no books at the time of Jesus, but rather there were scrolls that these parts of the Old Testament were written on, and the Old Testament was therefore a rather large collection of scrolls. Even just the first part, the first collection, the first section, as it were. It's not even the first section, it's the first collection of Jewish scriptures was the law, 5 scrolls. We have evidence from the time of Jesus that fairly clearly indicates that Jews thought of the canon in terms of 3 collections. Not really 3 sections at that time, but 3 collections. The law, the first 5 books, the prophets, that I'll come to in a second, and then a third group was the writings. The book of Sirach, which is in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Old Testament, dates to about 200 BC in its original form, and actually the part that talks about the sections of the Old Testament probably dates from later in the 100s BC. But basically it talks about the law, the prophets, and the other writings. And so you have, again, the law and the prophets. Whenever you see the law and the prophets in the New Testament, that's a shorthand for the Old Testament, for the collection of authoritative scriptures. The first collection of which is the law, the second collection of which is the prophets. In Luke 24, where Jesus is unfolding spiritually the Old Testament in terms of prediction of him, he talks about unfolding the law. It talks about unfolding the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. The Psalms are the lead-off hitter in the third collection of the Old Testament, the writings. And so Jews at the time of Christ conceptualized the Old Testament in terms of 3 sections: the law, the prophets, and the writings. The first of which, as I've just said, is the law. Now the law consists primarily of Mosaic material. What do I mean by that? Is that there's a lot of Moses quotes. Moses said this. In Exodus, Moses said this. In Leviticus, Moses says this. In Numbers, Moses says this. In Deuteronomy, Moses says this. So there are a lot of Moses quotes in the Pentateuch. And most of the time when the New Testament talks about Moses saying things, most of the time it is quoting Moses quotes. Now, here's where we get into somewhat controversial territory. Exodus through Deuteronomy are about Moses. There's a lot of Moses quotes, but they're in the third person. So what I'm talking about, the point of view of Exodus through Deuteronomy is Moses was born, Moses grew up, Moses did this, Moses said that, Moses went up into a mountain and died. Now from an inductive Bible study point of view, that is inductively, one would not naturally conclude that Moses was the author of Exodus through Deuteronomy, because Exodus through Deuteronomy are about Moses. They talk about Moses. These books are not worded in such a way as that you would naturally conclude that Moses was actually the one writing them. Similarly, the book of Genesis never mentions Moses, and some of the place names in Genesis date from, we know, the king period, which was long after Moses. And so again, if we were strictly going on the inductive evidence, nobody would conclude that Moses actually wrote any part of Genesis through Deuteronomy, although we might conclude that Moses says a lot of things. Moses is quoted a lot in Genesis through Deuteronomy. Now here's the rub. The problem with what I just said, or the challenge with what I just said, is not that it isn't listening to the text. In fact, that is the position that listens most closely to the Pentateuch text. So there's no problem in terms of listening to Genesis through Deuteronomy in terms of what I just said. The problem is that the New Testament and Jesus seem, at a few points, not just to say that Moses said certain things, but also to refer to the storytelling, the framing of Genesis through Deuteronomy. Not much. It's actually not that often. But there are a few places where the New Testament and even Jesus seem to say Moses says something when they're not quoting Moses, they're quoting the storytelling, the narrative of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And so it has been traditional for thousands of years to say that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And so the decision that you have to make is whether or not you think this is simply an example of the incarnation principle. That is, that when God revealed the books of the Bible, he revealed it within the categories of the day, and thus that when Jesus referred to the Old Testament, he referred to Moses as the author because he was following the conventions of his day, and that the point is not who wrote the Pentateuch, but basically to refer to inspired Scripture. You have to decide whether that is your position, or whether you think that when Jesus in the New Testament talked about Moses as a man will leave his father and mother, which is in the narrative of Genesis, it's not a quote of Moses in Genesis, that when Jesus said that, he was actually making an assertion about authorship and not just using the convention of his day. That's a decision. It's fighting. Those are fighting issues, have been, and something that you'll have to form your own conclusion on. Now, if you conclude that Jesus and the New Testament authors are simply following the convention of their day, then it would not be controversial to suggest that there may have been sources used behind, say, Genesis. This would not have been controversial if it had not been traditional to think of Moses as the author. Now, actually, back in the early days, 1700s I think it was, there were some that suggested that Moses used sources in putting together Genesis. The idea of there being sources behind Genesis, in and of itself, it doesn't contradict inspiration. It's not problematic in any way, except that you have this issue of whether or not the New Testament, part of the inspired message of the New Testament is that Moses is the author. That's where it gets tricky. The idea that there are sources in itself is not tricky at all, because of course most people are fine with the idea that Matthew and Luke use Mark as their primary source, or one of their primary sources. So, and of course, what these sources was, then you get into the weeds, and there's no need to do that. So let's move on. When Joshua and the books of Kings refer to the book of the law, most scholars would suggest that it's referring to Deuteronomy. If you read the way in which Deuteronomy flows into Joshua, and then Joshua refers back to the book of law, there seems to be a kind of continuity between Deuteronomy and Joshua, a kind of continuity that say Exodus and Joshua don't have. And in that sense, it makes most sense when Joshua in its early chapters talks about the book of the law to think that it is referring right back to Deuteronomy. And so again, I think it would be the position of most experts that when Josiah finds the book of the law in the temple, that what he is finding is some version of the book of Deuteronomy. However, after the exile, after Israel comes back from Babylon, we find the rise of the phrase the book of Moses. And at this point, it is reasonable to assume that the book of Moses, after Israel comes back from Babylon, that this now refers to the entire Pentateuch in the time of Ezra. Again, these are touchy subjects. You'll have to form your own conclusions. I believe that if we are really interested in the truth, sometimes people talk about being interested in the truth, but really all they want to do is find some way to justify the opinion they started out with. That's not real interested in the truth. If a person's truly interested in the truth, they have to be willing to change their mind if they are given enough basis to do so, whatever basis you might think is appropriate. And so if we are really interested in the truth and not simply reinforcing where we started with, then we have to keep an open mind on these sorts of things. The prophets. So if the law is the first part of the Old Testament, or the first collection of the Old Testament, the second collection at the time of Jesus was known as the prophets. Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, "I've not come to destroy the law and the prophets." What is he saying? He's saying, I've not come to destroy Scripture. I've come to give you a fuller sense of Scripture, a spiritual understanding of Scripture. So what are the prophets? Well, there were the former prophets. The former prophets in the Hebrew Bible consists of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now originally Samuel and Kings were only one book. Hebrew doesn't have vowels written in between the letters most of the time. Later on, in the Middle Ages, the Masoretes put points under the consonants to indicate what the vowels were. But if you buy a Hebrew newspaper in Jerusalem today, it will not have the vowels underneath. It's not pointed, is what we say. It's unpointed. And so when you add the vowels to a book like Samuel in Hebrew, it becomes much longer. And so 1st and 2nd Samuel arose in the Greek versions, the Greek translations of Samuel and Kings. These are the former prophets, the books that have people like Gideon and Barak and Samson and Elijah and Elisha. These are the books of the former prophets, the earlier prophets. These books are often called by scholars the Deuteronomistic history because they seem to embody the theology of Deuteronomy. For example, the book of Deuteronomy has a theology that would say that those who follow the law get rewarded in this life, and those who break the law get destroyed in this life. So when Israel goes to battle against Ai and they lose, it turns out to be because a guy named Achan has sinned. So they stone Achan, and after that they have victory again. Of course, this is only a partial theology. We find out in the New Testament from Jesus that a person can be righteous and still suffer, whereas the Deuteronomistic history don't really have a sense that you can suffer for being righteous. Their theology is much more the righteous are rewarded, and even in this life, because they don't really have much of a concept of the afterlife either. There's no concept of heaven and hell in the former prophets. And so reward and punishment are largely dispensed in this life. Now, it might not be to you, it might be to your children. So the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation, and so forth. This is a partial theology. We need the New Testament to give us the full theology on these kinds of issues. This is only part of the picture. The contents of the prophets here end with the exile, and so the most natural thing to assume is that these books were written, or at least reached their final form, either in the exile or after the exile. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever, in fact it's really rather irrational, to think that Joshua wrote Joshua or that Samuel wrote Samuel. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever. And just a little reflection, the book of Samuel goes way after the death of Samuel. Why would anyone think that Samuel wrote it? It's about Samuel in just a short part of it. There is some paradigm, interesting paradigm here that operated and still operates today in many people, to think that the primary character of a book is somehow the author of a book. It's a fascinating dynamic that we often find. Okay, the latter prophets then. If the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12. Notice I've missed some books. Daniel is not in the latter prophets in the Hebrew Bible. Daniel's in the writings. Book of Lamentations is in the writings. It's not in the latter prophets. You might have noticed that Chronicles wasn't in the former prophets. Chronicles are in the writings. The writings tend to be later, in my opinion. Most of those are later books, although not that all the materials in those books are later. So, for example, the Psalms may be later as a collection, but many of the Psalms are earlier, from the pre-exilic period, probably. So this is the layout of the latter prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. Again, this is a scroll of 12 prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi. Okay, so that's the section known as the prophets. Their content spans from the pre-exilic period. Hosea, is even northern kingdom in the 700s. Amos, northern kingdom, 700s, to post-exilic. Malachi, we're not even sure that Malachi is a name, because Malachi can mean my messenger, which would definitely be in probably the 400s. So the latter prophets are a large, and of course they wouldn't have been collected until after they were all written, and so the latter prophets are being collected in probably the 300s and 200s maybe. Some material may have accrued over centuries. Again, you have to make decisions on this. Isaiah 45 talks about Cyrus, king of Persia, who lived 200 years after Isaiah. And so the question you have to ask is that a prophecy? Is Isaiah prophesying about Cyrus in the future? Or is that part of Isaiah written from a later period? Isaiah's name isn't mentioned after chapter 36. There's nowhere in Isaiah 36 on that says Isaiah says this. And so from an inductive standpoint, if you look at the content of Isaiah 40 through 66 and you ask, given what is said here, what is the most likely date that this was written? Well, because it mentions Cyrus, the most natural conclusion is that this was written in the late 500s or early 400s. That would be the most natural inductive conclusion. Just because it's bound with Isaiah today, remember, they didn't have scrolls that long. The book of Isaiah would have had to have been on more than one scroll, maybe three scrolls even. And so just because when you go to the Christian bookstore today and you buy a Bible, Isaiah is all packaged together, does not at all, in fact, it's not at all likely that these scrolls were on one scroll back at the time of Isaiah himself. Again, why is this an issue? The only reason why this is an issue is because Jesus and the New Testament refer to material in those latter chapters as Isaiah saying things. And so again, you have to decide whether this is simply a convention, the incarnation principle, where Jesus and the New Testament authors are speaking within the paradigms of the New Testament times, or whether this is a intention on God's part to tell us historical authorship. And you have to make that decision, what you think yourself. Then the third section is the writings. The Psalms leads off the writings. I realize Job comes first in our Bible, but not in the way the writings are usually conceptualized. Proverbs. Then you have the five scrolls: Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. Megalot. This is a collection of smaller writings from the Old Testament. In our Bible, these are scattered. Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah are sometimes considered one book, and then of course 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the end of the writings. Again, the dates span from pre-exilic to post-exilic times that these were written. So that's the third collection that may have been in flux even at the time of Jesus. Jesus doesn't say the law, the prophets, and the writings. He says the law and the prophets and the Psalms. And so these other, this third section, this third part of the collection may have been still a little bit in flux at the time of Jesus. So when did the canon close? When did they say, that's it, this is a wrap? Well, I actually think that it's after the New Testament was written, as I just said. The Protestant canon is arguably the canon of the Pharisees. Now this is we're getting into really debatable territory here, but it seems to me that the books that are considered authoritative by Protestants is largely the same as the books that the Pharisees at the time of Jesus would have considered authoritative. Now the Essenes, another group, used many other books, some of which the New Testament authors do engage. So Jude quotes 1st Enoch. I wonder if some early Christians were Essenes or used as scripture some of the books that are in the Essene canon. The Sadducees may have stuck more to the first 5 books, the law, and engaged those other books less. Diaspora Jews may have engaged the books outside the law less. Now the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, was the Bible of the earliest Christians. So we do find the New Testament authors engaging Greek books like the Book of Wisdom. Romans 1, Paul may be using material from the Book of Wisdom or drawing on material from the Book of Wisdom. When Jesus says in Matthew, "Take my yoke on you," this may be an allusion to the Book of Sirach. And so the edges of the Old Testament canon may have been a little fuzzy at the time of Jesus. Jerome considered the books of Sirach and Wisdom to be in a second canon, a Deuterocanon. Luther took them out. The Roman Catholic Church in response then upgraded them. So it seems to be, I think the most natural conclusion is that those 7 books that ended up in the Roman Catholic canon, that they were kind of in a second tier until Luther said, no, I don't like them at all. And then the Roman Catholic Church says, well, we're going to make them full scripture, proto-canonical, at the Council of Trent in 1545. One final word on the text of the Old Testament. In some ways, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, is our oldest witness to the text of the Old Testament, although the Septuagint sometimes seems to have taken liberties with its translation, or have been interesting in its translation. And so Christians used the Septuagint so extensively to argue for Christ that the Jews of the 2nd century A.D. Retranslated it. The Dead Sea Scrolls are our oldest Hebrew witness to the text of the Old Testament, and let's date them to about 100 B.C. The Masoretic texts that we like to talk about them, counting numbers and finding the center point, those date from the early Middle Ages. So some of the practices we like to talk about in terms of the reverence of the scriptural text actually date from much after the period during which the Old Testament was written. And that is the text and canon of the Old Testament.